Hey, 42 here. It's November 2009. An unassuming Saturday afternoon in the heart of Venice unfolds just like any other. Except for one small detail. A group of pallbearers are accompanying a hot pink coffin down an overcrowded canal, led by a somber-faced man donning a black cloak. Something has died. Not someone, but something. The few remaining residents of Venice are holding a funeral for the city that was. The permanent population of Venice had just dipped below 60,000, half of what it was in the 1960s. This was a public funeral put on as a publicity stunt by activists and residents of Venice to mourn the supposed death of the city due to over-tourism. As of writing this video, the population has plummeted even more precipitously to just 50,000. Venice is one of the most touristic cities in the world, and this UNESCO World Heritage Site is a fragile place. Most of the historic buildings are sat on top of wooden piles driven into the seabed. With all that foot traffic and endless boats stuffed with tourists, there is a very real risk that Venice could be eroded bit by bit until the very foundations of the city itself are compromised. But Venice is fighting back. In 2021, the Italian government banned large cruise ships from entering the Venetian lagoon. And in 2024, Venice will begin charging every tourist €5 per day just to enter the city if they aren't staying overnight. Venice has actually installed theme park-esque turnstiles at the entrances to the city near the train station to control numbers and enforce the fees, leading some locals to rename the city Veniceland. But all this raises a moral, social, and economic dilemma. Is this overwhelming amount of tourism a good or a bad thing? Does tourism destroy a city by eroding the local community and pushing up prices for locals? Or does the money that tourism brings in outweigh the cons? Keeps is an online subscription service that makes it easy and affordable for men to treat their male pattern baldness. Get expert care for hair loss from the comfort of your home without ever visiting a doctor's office or pharmacy. And all treatment plans are personalized to address your unique needs. And treatment plans are affordable, typically half the cost of traditional pharmacy prices. Keeps offers both of the FDA-approved hair loss treatment options, as well as a 2-in-1 gel that combines both treatments. According to clinical studies, treatments offered by Keeps are 90% effective at treating hair loss and can increase hair growth by up to 35%. In addition to clinically proven treatments, Keeps offers hair thickening, shampoo, conditioner, and a styling pomade, which I love. Most Keeps customers will notice results within 6 months of starting their treatment. And to date, Keeps has helped nearly 1 million men to keep their hair. They also deliver your treatments directly to your door in discreet packaging, and with shipments every 3, 6, or 12 months, they work to your schedule. Hair loss stops with Keeps. For a special offer to get you started, go to keeps.com/42, or just click the link in the description. That's keeps.com/42. And a big thanks to Keeps for sponsoring this video. Tourism is one of the most hypocritical industries in the world. Most people will mouth off incessantly about how tourism is a plague on their city and regale about its many evils. Then those same people will go to bed that night dreaming of their upcoming vacations to Rome, Barbados, or Blackpool. But what's the truth? Should we be limiting tourism, or should we be squeezing every dime out of our cultural centres and natural beauty spots? Well, the answer might surprise you, and if you watch until the end of this video, you might never feel the same way about tourists ever again. Our world is truly special. Not only do we have more natural beauty than one man can see in a lifetime, but as a species, we've spent the past few thousand years crafting a tapestry of culture. We have etched that culture, our collective human story, into buildings. Buildings that have created cities. Cities that have told stories. Stories that have been retold through plays, books, and films, and shaped the way we live our lives today. So it's hardly surprising that almost everyone has a desire to go and see these cities, buildings, and stories firsthand. International tourism didn't actually exist, at least not on a large scale, until the 18th century. For thousands of years, people lived their lives mostly locally, rarely stepping foot out of their hometowns. Then, in the 17 and 1800s, young upper-class men would embark on what is known as a grand tour, usually at the age of 21. It was basically the first example of what we know today as a gap year. It was seen as a way to round out a young man's knowledge and character and instill him with culture in a way that reading books just can't do. Oh, they also had a lot of sex along the way. Truth be told, that was probably the main attraction. Lord Byron was one of the most infamous grand tourists. He spent more than 2 years shagging his way around Europe. There were a few popular routes, but they almost always started in London. After a ferry to France, the spunky young tourist would typically make his way to Paris, Lyon, Bern, Venice, Florence, then Rome. But other routes went through Germany and Austria, or Spain. International tourism was restricted to the middle and upper classes for centuries, culminating in the golden age of cruising in the 1950s. However, it wasn't until the proliferation of cheap air travel that the working class could finally escape the dreary British weather and even drearier seaside resorts for a spot of sun in places like Spain, Italy, and Greece. In the 1980s and 90s, budget airlines such as Ryanair and EasyJet began offering cheap-as-chips seats on short-haul European flights. Today, you can fly from London to destinations like Paris, Rome, and Berlin for less than the price of your evening meal when you arrive. Over the following 50 years, tourist arrivals, especially in Europe, exploded. Overwhelming numbers of Chinese tourists in the past decade has also been a huge contributor to these stats, since China's middle class has been ballooning since 2000. Of course, it didn't take long before these millions of tourists had a profound effect on our planet. Take Amsterdam. It's one of the great cultural and historic centres of the world. But the city centre, particularly the red light district, is now full almost every night of the year with what have been deemed as party tourists. Every day, a deluge of stag doos descend on this den of delights like sex-craved denizens during the last days of Rome. They litter, throw beer bottles and other trash into the canals, start fights, cause excessive noise, and urinate in places you wouldn't even have thought were possible. The problem has grown so bad that the city of Amsterdam has actually started an online ad campaign to dissuade them from arriving. When men between 18 to 35, particularly British men, search online for terms like stag do Amsterdam or pub crawl Amsterdam, they'll be met with paid ads, literally telling them to stay away. The Greek island of Santorini is one of the most beautiful lumps of volcanic rock on our blue planet. It isn't a surprise that 2 million people come here every year. But Santorini is also a small island with a population of just 15,000, and the winding streets are super narrow. In some places, only one person can fit down at once. And so, a visit to Santorini in the peak months results in a line of thousands of people who are literally queuing to walk down a street. Furthermore, most of the day trippers arrive at Santorini on a cruise ship that pollutes the azure waters of this otherwise serene sanctuary. Santorini is one of the most Instagrammed places on the planet. But behind every perfectly framed Insta, just out of shot, is an army of tourists all pushing each other out of the way to get the exact same photo. Now, you may assume that over-tourism is relatively harmless. After all, we can clean up the litter that crowds leave behind, we can repair superficial damage, we can do our best to cleanse polluted waters. But if the trend of surging tourist numbers continues to increase as it has, we might find that those marvels making people come in their millions might not last to marvel at for much longer. Because the world's most visited tourist spots all have one thing in common. Really old shit. Whether it's Istanbul's Hagia Sophia, Athens' Parthenon, Egypt's pyramids, or basically everything in Rome. And the problem with really old stuff is that it's incredibly fragile, and all of them are now under a very real threat of erosion from human activity. Every year, the Italian government spends millions on maintaining and restoring the Colosseum. But there's only so much that can be done. ever-increasing car traffic around the ancient amphitheatre has caused a layer of black soot to form all over its exterior, which recently had to be cleaned up at great expense. Vibrations from the daily hordes of tour groups cause minor instabilities in the structure of the concrete and travertine walls and floors, causing very small fragments to break off as dust. Although minor, over time this erosion takes its toll, and the more tourists that pass through these harrowing corridors, the faster it will crumble. Then there's the unavoidable fact that for every 1,000 respectful tourists, you're going to get 1 or 2 "see you next Tuesdays." Like the 2 women from California who, only a few years back, decided to sneak away from their tour group to carve their names into the walls of the Colosseum. Now, because they were highly intelligent life forms, they also made sure to take selfies with their handiwork and upload it to social media, so everyone, including the Italian police, could see just how magnificently worthless humans they are. Of all the historical artifacts, Machu Picchu is probably one of the worst victims of human erosion. UNESCO has recommended a limit of 2,500 visitors per day to this Incan citadel, but during peak months the actual number is more than double. Some tourists clamber on the stones, which are vulnerable to being dislodged since they were built without the use of mortar, which is ironically one of the main draws of this place. Presumably the Incas thought that building Machu Picchu, the best part of a 4-day hike away, would dissuade most people from visiting it. But that didn't bloody work, did it? If tourist numbers continue to increase, Machu Picchu may be a shell of its current state in just a few decades. But Machu Picchu is symptomatic of hundreds of other old, vulnerable, well-trodden sites all over the world. From Stonehenge to Petra, we humans are slowly but surely stepping all over our own history, stomping it back into the ground. So, what's the solution? Well, there are some options that often get bandied about, but the truth is, I don't particularly like any of them. And I'll tell you why. We could firstly restrict access to historic sites, either by banning tourists altogether or by only allowing researchers and academics to visit them. But I'm sure that you, like I, would find it a little sad if only certain individuals could enjoy the majesty and wonder of the collective history of our species firsthand. Such a solution smacks of elitism, and it would result in only those with the right connections or birth or from certain elite universities being able to enjoy such places. Personally, I think that everyone should be able to stand in the Roman Forum and breathe in the air in the beating heart of the most significant empire in our history. Every man, woman and child should have the right to clamber over the basalt columns at Giant's Causeway and experience Mother Nature's perplexingly precise magic unfolding beneath their feet. Others would argue that we should simply charge people more to visit popular sites. Tourist taxes already exist in most popular cities, from Venice to Barcelona to Dubrovnik. Couldn't we simply increase these taxes and introduce similar fees in destinations that don't have them already? Shouldn't we vastly increase the ticket prices to ring-fenced attractions like the Acropolis, Sagrada Familia, and the Tower of London? Well, yes, we could, but it wouldn't solve the problem. People would still stump up the cash. People treasure their yearly vacations very highly, and for good reason. For most people, it's their only escape from routine, and it may be the only reason they work so hard in the first place. If they have the desire to go, people will find a way. This solution is also very similar to the last in that it encourages elitism. Those who can afford the new higher prices will still go anyway, and many of those who can't will probably still go, but it will just hurt them a lot more. They may have to take out loans or put these new travel expenses on high-interest credit cards. Travel is already expensive enough as it is. And don't get me wrong, it should be pricey. Travel is a luxury, not a right. And there are hundreds of people within the travel system, from taxi drivers to cleaners, who need to be paid a fair wage. But we shouldn't be artificially inflating prices just to keep the so-called riffraff out and to artificially reduce tourist numbers by limiting financial accessibility. People of all incomes and backgrounds should have the opportunity to visit at least some of these special places at some point in their lives. And what if I told you that almost every argument I've made in this video so far might be a straw man argument? What if over-tourism isn't so much of a problem, but an asset? The media loves nothing more than to chastise tourists, writing damning alarmist headlines about the damage they're causing, and live our lives within our own four walls, or else the planet will be destroyed and Greta Thunberg will come round and whip you. Meanwhile, those very same journalists probably enjoy their 5 or more vacations a year, jostling with the same crowds that they railed against only a month earlier in their weekly column. Because it turns out that over-tourism may not be such a bad thing after all. In fact, the very term over-tourism might be a bit of a misnomer. Here's why. The biggest benefit to tourism is that it's a powerful economic engine, and it provides some locations with a much-needed income injection. A whopping 10% of Italy's GDP comes from tourism. That's huge. In Greece, it's 11.5%, and Spain is 12.4%. Tourism is a huge creator of jobs in countless towns and cities of all sizes across the world. Only 50,000 people might live in Venice these days, but the tourism industry supports 70,000 jobs in the city. Venice will soon charge day trippers to enter, despite the fact that a whopping 30% of the city's revenue comes from day trippers alone, and that's not factoring in all the other tourists who stay overnight. I mentioned earlier that sites like the Colosseum are being eroded by human activity, usually from a combination of foot traffic and vehicles. And don't get me wrong, it is a concern. But do you really think that the Colosseum would still look as magnificent and relatively unchanged over the past decades as it does today, if it weren't for the huge amount of money it generates each year? Ticket sales alone bring in about 100 million euros each year, but it goes further than that. Financial consultancy firm Deloitte estimated that the Colosseum actually contributes about 1.3 billion euros each year to Italy's economy. It costs a few $1 million each year to maintain this building, a fraction of what it earns. Some of those who are employed to work on it are world experts in restoration, stonework, and archaeology. Do you really think that this building, and many others alike, would be babied to such an extent if it didn't act as such a powerful crucible of capitalism for its mother country? And there's another positive byproduct of tourism that is often overlooked by the naysayers: emotional power. Travel is usually a positive experience, and it creates many happy memories. This creates an emotional bond between a person and a place. You get warm, fuzzy feelings when you remember that childhood trip to Spain with your parents. Perhaps your spouse proposed to you next to the canals of Amsterdam, or Bruges, or Venice, or Birmingham, and you still said yes. Maybe you just yearn to be taken back to that summer you spent traveling the Italian countryside, as you enjoyed all the heady aromas and tastes that you can still experience in your mind as though it was yesterday. If you weren't allowed to or couldn't afford to visit these cities, monuments, and great wildernesses firsthand, we would never develop such strong emotional connections with them. It's really difficult to fall in love with the labyrinthine back streets of Barcelona by just reading about them in a guidebook. And because of a deep love for and feeling of connection to these places that we've been, people regularly and routinely donate money to repair buildings, maintain landscapes, and clean up city streets. People who don't even live in said city. International organizations are also incentivized to put money and effort into protecting the places that people love the most, such as UNESCO, ICOMOS, and others. You could think of it like this. By inviting the world in to share these special places, it creates a global awareness and shared love for those places, which imbues them with a sort of protective bubble. When we hear stories of people defacing the Colosseum, like I mentioned earlier, people lose their collective shit. Almost every major newspaper worldwide reported on that story. It's funny, isn't it? The Colosseum is just a concrete building, but it's universally loved and adored, and millions of people around the world would have quite a lot to say and take significant action if it was ever seriously threatened. And it isn't just the big hitters, the Colosseums and Eiffel Towers of the world, that benefit from tourism. There are small towns and villages dotted all over the globe that are supported primarily by, or sometimes wholly by, tourism. Since the Industrial Revolution, a well-documented phenomenon has been taking place: an exodus of smaller population centres towards larger population centres. It still happens today, and it's a trend that shows no sign of stopping. When young people reach working age, a large percentage of them will up sticks from their sleepy town or quiet country village and make haste to the big smoke. Whether it be London, Paris or New York, you've probably noticed it yourself within your friendship circle. But tourism can help to stem that bleeding. It provides job opportunities and even self-employment for people of all ages in the places they grow up. From restaurants that are only open because of the local tourist trade, to tour operators. Welcome to the charming village of Hallstatt, Austria. It used to enjoy a thriving economy from the production of salt. But demand dried up, and the town's very existence was threatened. However, come the 21st century, this crumbling community was thrown a tourism lifeline. As interest surged, so did the crowds. This town of only 800 residents now receives a staggering 3 million yearly visitors, who flock to enjoy the breathtaking scenery on the skywalk, descend into an underground salt mine, and stroll through the quaint old town. In 1997, Hallstatt was listed as a UNESCO World Heritage Site. The locals might despise the crowds today, but they create jobs, opportunities, and although they do degrade the town, they also indirectly maintain it. It's fair to say that without them, this town, without any other notable industry, would be a shadow of its former self. And it isn't alone. There are countless similar examples all over the world of places that have been saved from the brink of extinction by tourism. Think of Whitby in the UK, Bruges in Belgium, and Greece's Santorini. Some people like to believe that these historic places, without tourism, can always look the same, function the same, and remain as quaint little fishing or farming villages for all eternity. And nothing would ever crumble or stop working, and nobody would ever leave, and the locals would be forever happy and well off. And if we could simply remove the tourists, then the status quo from 50 years ago would return overnight. But often, that's a pipe dream. The world has changed. Industry has changed. The way we live, work, and travel has changed. If these places didn't adapt to and pander to tourism, some of them would become dilapidated. Want proof? Before all those budget airlines came along, in the Victorian era, it was popular for the British working class to holiday in British seaside resorts like Blackpool, Morecambe, Margate, Rhyl, and many others. All of these places have seen a precipitous decline in tourist numbers over the past 50 years. Due to cheap air travel, the British have instead opted to seek warmer weather abroad, which has perfectly correlated with the social and economic decline of seaside resorts all up and down the nation, many of which now struggle with unemployment, homelessness, drugs, and crime. I'm not saying the story would always be the same if you remove the tourists from any town or city. There are, of course, countless small villages and towns all over the world that thrive with zero tourists. But once tourism has embedded itself into a community's prosperity, one should remove that tourism with great care, because the outcome is rarely a pretty one. Whether we like it or not, tourism is here to stay. The global population is increasing. The middle class is growing in developing countries, enabling them to travel more than ever before. So just maybe, instead of chastising tourists, we should find a way to balance our world's precious natural and cultural heritage with people's desires to experience it firsthand. If we can achieve that goal, then everyone wins. And as a tourist, we should travel with great care and respect for other people, cultures, and places. Because the more we respect others, the more we will be welcomed to new places with open arms. instead of placards telling us to stay away. Thanks for watching. Just a quick word to say that I couldn't make these videos without the support of my Patreon members. Consider joining the exclusive 42 Discord community by supporting me on Patreon. It's a great place to discuss my videos with like-minded individuals and myself. The link's in the description, but if you don't want to, or you can't join my Patreon, then please don't worry. A simple like or comment to say thanks would also put a huge smile on my face. Thank you.